I was chatting just now with my goddaughter by text about archaeology. She is willing to speak history with me. Very few people are. She's fantastic. We've been chatting about the idea that it's a pity Africa doesn't do more digging. I've heard that with dinosaurs, for example, Africa hasn't been dug up enough. We're surely there are more dinosaurs down there. Europe has been dug up very carefully, looking for dinosaurs, but also just archaeology of humans who have existed only in the last blink of an eye compared to when dinosaurs were here. In the texts, I just mentioned something I've heard, that if in Africa we wish that there was more digging in Africa so we can uncover some of the glories of Africa that haven't been uncovered so far. You would think that would be a good thing to happen here in Australia too. But Indigenous Australians, because of their belief system, it's heartbreaking for them when, for example, by and large, there might be exceptions, of course. It's heartbreaking for them when the bones of some ancestor are dug up. The whole timelessness, dreaming thing, because that ancestor, even if in Western linear time, even if that ancestor died 40,000 years ago or whatever, that person is still real. With Westerners, for Indigenous people, with Westerners, if someone's more than 500 years old, if we dig up someone who died, say 300 or 400 or 500 years ago, or 600 or 700, 800 years ago, they've lost their humanness. Is that a biblical thing? Is that why we think that? Because their soul has departed and all that sort of stuff. But with Indigenous people, and the bones are nothing. When my grandmother died, our priest said that, people were really feeling fairly sad looking at her coffin in the church. And he said, "What are you looking at that for?" This is what our priest said. It was actually a good little circuit breaker moment. And he said, "She's not in there. She's up in heaven. I knew her well. She's up in heaven." He did know her well. All right. And I said, "Oh." We kind of stopped looking at the coffin and cheered up a little bit, So this is kind of a Western way of thinking, or a North African way of thinking, or a Middle Eastern way of thinking, whatever. With Indigenous people, though, I don't know. It's the whole person, I suppose. I don't know how it works, but the point is, when someone ends up in the ground or whatever, that you don't dig them back up again. It doesn't matter whether that person was put in the ground yesterday. Would you dig up someone who died yesterday? No. So why would you dig up someone who died 40,000 years ago? What's the difference? If in your culture time is circular and not linear, and that sort of thing. So for an Indigenous person, I think, there might be exceptions. I always like saying that. If an ancestor or whatever is in the ground, leave them alone. You don't dig them up. We had a famous moment where we found some 40,000-year-old bones. Lady Mungo, we called her, and we ended up having to put her back. That's weird for us as Westerners, but it made sense if you take into account Indigenous ways of thinking. So we actually went to all the expense of, I think we took Lady Mungo out of, where's Mungo Lake? South Australia or somewhere, I can't remember. transported her, the bones of her, all the way to the Australian National University or wherever it was, in Canberra, or I'm not sure where, and then Indigenous people got really upset. What are you doing with our ancestor? And Westerners were thinking, not your ancestor. 40,000 years ago, you can't, show us her birth certificate. That's the way we think, to prove that she's your direct ancestor and all that sort of stuff. That's the way we think. But they say, she's an ancestor, is the way Indigenous people think. She died just yesterday. Don't dig her up. She's still bloody fresh. Anyway, we kind of buried her again. We actually took her from wherever she was and drove her bones all the way back out to the same dry bed lake or whatever it is, Lake Mungo or whatever, and we buried her again. We put her in a coffin though. And the coffin is made of some unbreakable substance, and it's got 2 locks on it, and the Indigenous mob in the area's got one of the keys and we've got one of the keys, so it can't be opened by either them or us unless we both agree. It's very complicated. What a lot of trouble we went to for Lady Mungo. But the idea of burying such an important skeleton is amazing for Westerners. It's like taking what's her name, Lucy, in Ethiopia. At the moment, I'm sure she's in some museum somewhere or whatever, and in maybe a sort of glass cage that is temperature controlled, so she doesn't so that the bones don't turn to dust and all that sort of stuff. And great care is, because she needs to be there for the future, so that people can see a skeleton that's, she's millions of years old or whatever she is. Lady Mungo, one of the oldest known Indigenous Australians, is nothing compared to Lucy for age. But it's like, imagine suggesting that we rebury Lucy in the ground and let her bones go to dust. It's unthinkable for Westerners, but for Indigenous people, it makes sense. But the other thing about Indigenous people, though, it's a dilemma really, because they don't want, with exceptions, they don't want you digging up old, don't fossick around Granny's old bones. They don't want that. Even if Granny was 40,000 years ago. But on the flip side of that, I think Indigenous people, and I've heard this because sometimes Indigenous people accompany archaeologists on digs and all that sort of stuff, I think they understand that because we respect people more if we can find their old bones, we Westerners, because we think that way, they kind of know that if they don't let us dig up Granny's bones, they'll miss out on some prestige and maybe some land rights and all sorts of things, and some respect. So to a certain extent, Indigenous people are stuck. It's heartbreaking to see Granny dug up, but they'll never get the respect they deserve unless they let the Westerners dig up Granny, because then the Indigenous people sit back in some sort of bemusement and watch Westerners go into a complete tiz all across the world because Granny got dug up, just because she happened to be 40,000 years ago, because she was buried 40,000 years ago and not 2 years ago. Whereas the Indigenous person is saying, what are these creatures called Westerners who think that something 40,000 years ago matters more than 2 years ago? We're going to have to go. It's the only way we're going to get some respect. All right, because they think that way, we're going to have to let them. But they don't know what they're doing. They got their